This pin shows up in a ton of different openings, and you've probably lost a bunch of games simply because you didn't know how to punish it. But after studying Capablanca, I started noticing that this pin actually gets them into trouble. And after today, you're gonna hope they play it against you. So yeah, no messing around. I'm Philip. Let's jump right in. First, let's talk about tactical patterns you can use to take that bishop. And we're also going to talk about how to take advantage of the bishop strategically. Think about what you would play here while we go over how we got this position. e4, d5, the Scandinavian defense. Pawn takes d5, queen takes d5, knight to c3, queen back to d8, knight to f3, and bishop to g4, pinning the knight. The moves almost everybody looks at are bishop to e2 or h3. Let's break them down and see how to punish this pin early in the game and start creating problems for your opponent. There's nothing wrong with bishop to e2, but the bishop ends up on a pretty passive square. From here, your opponent gets to be the one attacking, and you're basically just reacting to what they're doing. h3 is already a move I like more, with the idea that if the bishop backs up, you're going to go g4 and probably castle queenside. But what do I actually recommend here? I recommend bishop to c4, because bishop to c4 develops the bishop to a much more active, more aggressive square, grabs space, and starts taking over the position. Here, your opponent has to react to bishop to c4, and most of the time they're going to play e6, which takes some of the sting out of the bishop. So why is that basically forced? Because if they try to develop instead, from here your opponent really only has two options. They can go knight to f6, and there's actually a trap there that'll show you in just a second, or they can go knight to c6. And if they play that move, they've basically already lost the game, right? Why is that? Well, the bishop is x-raying the queen here, so if that knight ever moves, you just lose the queen. But that bishop isn't defended, so if that knight moves with check, your opponent is actually the one who ends up losing the bishop, right? So this tactical pattern that wins the bishop is the bishop takes on f7 idea, basically forcing your opponent into a position where your knight gets to come in with check. Now, you've sacked a bishop, but you're going to win a bishop right back. And on top of that, you've also taken away your opponent's right to castle and picked up a pawn in the process. So this position is already way nicer to play for white, and in the hands of a skilled player, it's basically winning, because now your opponent's king is forced to sit exposed in the center with isolated pawns, right? Meanwhile, you'll castle pretty soon on whichever side you want, and from there, you're just going to have a really comfortable game going forward. Now, if they go knight to f6, you play bishop takes f7, king takes, and then you follow up with knight to e5. From there, once the king moves, we just take the bishop on g4, and once again, we're up a pawn. Or you can also go knight to e5, basically sacking your queen, because if they take your queen, you just follow up with bishop takes f7, and that's checkmate. But then you might be thinking, okay, what if they play bishop to e6? Well, then you trade, and your opponent is left with a pretty bad position. Doubled pawns in the center, the bishop on f8 is going to take forever to get into the game, and meanwhile, we've got solid development and a really nice position. Now let's take a look at how to deal with the pin when you're playing against the Italian. e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, knight to c3, knight to f6, the Italian opening, then d3, d6, and now comes bishop to g5, basically pinning the knight with the idea of following up with knight to d5 and adding even more pressure to that pin. So in this position, with the bishop already outside the pawn chain, what do you actually do here, right? Well, you can consider h6 here to gain some time and kick white's bishop. If it drops back to h4, you can even think about g5. And like a lot of people really don't like that because they think it kind of kills your kingside castling and exposes your king. That's why some players say it's not even worth playing g5. And honestly, at first glance, I mean, that does make sense. But who says you're even forced to castle short? You haven't committed to that at all yet. And once you push the bishop back to g3, just notice how awkward it looks. It's literally a piece that never really gets into the game, doesn't create any real pressure, and at the end of the day, it doesn't mess with your plan whatsoever. And there's more. With that bishop completely out of action, it almost feels like white is playing a piece down. You're basically up a piece in practical terms. To get that bishop back into the game, they're going to have to spend several moves, and by the time that happens, you've already picked up enough compensation, especially with all the space and initiative coming from those kingside pawn pushes. And now, for example, you can go queen to d7 and castle long. That's a really solid idea. So another option is to start creating problems right away while the king is still in the center. Since the position is still pretty close, you can hold off on castling for now and just focus on the initiative. A very typical idea here is bishop to g4, immediately creating your own threats. On top of that, knight to d4 is also a really good option. And of course, you want to keep an eye on other possible lines too, depending on what white does. Now, if white responds with h3, how should you react? And if you're on the fence about whether you should take the knight on f3, let me tell you something real quick. I've got some important news for you. These moments, these trades, they're huge. Any player who actually takes chess seriously, even if you're just starting out, has to be able to look at a position and instantly tell whether a trade helps your game or hurts it. And if you want to dive deeper into this idea, I recorded a full video just on this topic. The card is popping up right here, so you can check it out later. Well, yeah, we don't need to trade here. We're not about to give up a good piece. So we just go bishop to h5 and keep the pin, because the idea of knight to d4 is still very much on the table. If white just ignores everything and castles, you can go knight to d4, or you can play h5, threatening h4, and then we just take the bishop. If they answer with h4, then we go knight to d4, white takes the pawn on g5, attacking our knight, and we basically ignore that threat and keep going with h4. The bishop drops back to h2, we follow up with h3, and now if the opponent ever takes the knight on f6, we take on g2, attacking the rook. From here, we've got tons of threats, the knight is hanging, and everything just starts falling apart. I mean, what white is even supposed to do here isn't really clear. The game is literally lost. For example, if at some point they try h3, well, now we can already take on f3. They go queen takes f3, and then we play g4, looking to blow open the position and open up the h-file. The queen drops back to d1, the king steps up to e7, and the whole idea is to later bring the queen over to the h-file and just deliver mate, because with the f-pawn pinned, it's like extremely hard for white to defend here. So here, we're in a position that's really similar to the first one we looked at, with the same sacrifice themes on f7. We're in the philidor defense, your knight is pinned, and your bishop on c4 is pointing straight at the pawn on f7. But I want you to see what happens if you sack the bishop on f7 here. The king takes on f7, then the knight goes to g5, giving check and setting things up so you can take the bishop. But this position is actually different, and this is, a really common mistake I see beginners make when they're looking at this tactic. And the problem is that in this position, your opponent's queen can just take your knight. And you're thinking, yeah, but the knight was defended, right? So what if I take with the bishop? If you take your opponent's queen with your bishop, he's going to take your queen. And after everything gets traded off, you're down a piece. Because it's not just the knight you also lost the bishop you sacked on f7. Meanwhile, your opponent only lost the bishop on g4. So in this case, you just end up down material. So this position is also good to show another point. The knight doesn't always have to come with check. Sometimes it comes with a big threat instead. In this position, for example, you go h3, and if the bishop goes to h5, you've got one of the most famous checkmates in chess, which is called Legal's mate. That's when you sack your queen with knight takes e5. And here, if your opponent takes your queen, which was the whole point of the pin, you get this classic mating pattern. Bishop takes f7, king to e7, then knight to d5, checkmate. And just to show you why you've got to calculate before you sack material, what happens if your opponent doesn't take your queen? Then his bishop just drops, you're still up a pawn, and if he decides to take your bishop pair, you want to just take the knight with your pawn. Now, let's take a look at how to deal with this pin and queen's pawn openings. So, d4, d5, knight to f3, knight to f6. Like, that's the Kali system. And when you play e3, the bishop goes to g4 right away, basically pinning your knight. So, the question is, how do you punish this move strategically, right? Well, here, you've got to look at this objectively, because if your opponent pins your knight and you haven't committed your king to castling on the king side yet, it's usually totally fine to just push your pawns, grab space, and, question the piece that's doing the pinning. But I'll show you in a second what to do if you've already castled, because once your king is on g1, you've got to handle this a bit more carefully. I know people don't like going h3 followed by g4, but if there's no king sitting on g1, there's literally nothing to be afraid of. Later on, your king can always castle queenside. Well, and that's exactly the point. You haven't committed to castling kingside yet, so you can play more aggressively. You're going to attack the bishop, chase it with your pawns and pieces, and you'll see what happens as the pressure builds and that bishop starts running out of good squares. So the bishop goes to g6, And from here, you can go knight to e5, threatening to win the bishop pair. And let's say your opponent responds with knight to d7, which is a pretty common move in this position. Here, you don't even need to take your opponent's bishop, because you can just threaten to trap it with h4, right? And the idea is really straightforward. If your opponent doesn't realize that this bishop is about to run out of squares and plays e6, then you follow up with h5, and at that point, the bishop is just trapped. He might still think he can get out by going bishop to e4, but it doesn't work because you go f3, and you just end up a piece up without needing anything fancy at all. Well, but let's say your opponent realizes you're threatening to win the piece and decides to react by creating a safe square for the bishop, right? And a really common way to do that is by going h6. So now you take your opponent's bishop and look at what you just did to his pawn structure. Because, I mean, it's not just that he lost the bishop pair, which by itself is already a very real advantage. He's basically left with a wrecked pawn structure, and he's stuck with these weakened pawns for the rest of the game. If you get hit with his bishop pin and your king isn't committed to castling on that side, don't be afraid to go h3, g4, and just push those pawns with confidence. Now let's take a look at how Capablanca absolutely punishes this pen, and just like I promised earlier, how to deal with this idea even after you've already castled. In this game, Capablanca is black against Winter, who's white. They go into the 4 knights opening, and I'm going to run through a few moves here. So after white goes d3, Capablanca replies with bishop to d6, defending the pawn on e5. Then white goes bishop to g5, pending the knight, and now the kings are already castled, so the natural question is, how do you deal with this pen? Let's see how Capablanca solves it. He goes h6, and this is a really smart move, because it forces your opponent to make an immediate decision. The bishop has to choose between taking the knight, dropping back, or moving somewhere else. And even if your opponent insists on keeping your pen, like white did in this game, you've always got g5 in your back pocket, just kicking that bishop whenever it's convenient. But Capablanca goes for something much more subtle and plays c5. And this move already takes away white's chance to hit the center later on, while at the same time kinda inviting white to go straight for their main attacking plan. Well, white wants to exploit this pin, so if they really want to put pressure on the knight, the most natural move is basically bringing the other knight to d5, because now you're adding another piece onto that pinned knight. And at first glance, it can look like black's position is a little awkward, which is exactly why white gets tempted to take here. That's exactly what white's trying to do here, destroy the pawn structure, open up lines, and leave the king more exposed. So Capablanca goes g5, and with this push, he's taken the first step in a really clear plan that we're about to see unfold. Right here, white decides to take the knight on g6, and there's an important thing to point out. Anytime you push the g5 after you've castled, you've literally got to watch out for a possible knight sack on g5, because in some positions, that's actually really dangerous. If your opponent gives up the knight and you're still stuck in the pen after the trade, white can end up winning that piece, and on top of that, your king gets exposed, right? But Capablanca had already seen all of this coming, and he knew this capture just doesn't work. If white sacks the knight on g5 to keep the attack going, black first trades on d5 before recapturing, and that in-between move completely changes everything. After the exchange, the queen comes alive on the diagonal, and when black finally recaptures, they don't just end up a knight up. The pawn, backed up by the queen, is also hitting the bishop. The bishop has to drop back, and black finishes with a full extra piece with zero compensation for the opponent. So you've got to be careful with this idea anytime you're thinking about pushing g5, because this whole sequence has got to be calculated before you ever push that pawn. So, in the game, white takes the knight on f6, the queen recaptures, and then the bishop drops back to g3. A lot of people look at this and think black's king is exposed, so they assume black must be worse. But here, it's actually the exact opposite. The main thing Capablanca saw is that this bishop is now trapped because it can't go anywhere. You're seeing the same themes from the earlier examples show up again, and now it's basically like white is playing a bishop down with no real way to fix it. So how does this continue from here? Now you go h5, and suddenly the whole situation flips around. While your opponent thought they were going to be the one attacking on the king's side, now you're the one taking over, threatening h4 and just taking the bishop. And the best part is, if they try h3 to make an escape square, that just gives you another tempo to go h4 and keep building up your attack. So you'll want to keep that pressure going. The bishop drops back to h2, and that gives you yet another tempo to go g4 and kick the knight on f3. If white goes pawn takes g4, basically that lets you bring your bishop out with tempo, and now the pin completely flips in your favor. On top of that, you're also threatening h3 to remove the knight's only defender. And doesn't stop there, you've got the g-file open so you can drop a rook there and really crank up the attack. In positions like this, white often resigns just a few moves later, right? In the game, Capablanca goes for something more solid and plays bishop to g4, and white doesn't think it's a real threat, so they go h3. Now I really want you to pay attention here because notice how the whole situation is completely flipped, and now we're the ones exploiting the pin. This part is really instructive, positionally and strategically, because Capablanca decides to trade everything on f3, and then he follows it up with f6 to really solidify everything. And here's the key detail. Now this bishop doesn't have any useful squares left besides h2. It's totally trapped with no way out. If you think about it, for white to ever activate this bishop, they love to push the pawn and free up the f2 square, basically bringing it back to life. But because of the doubled pawns, that just isn't realistic anymore. I mean, it might be possible, but it's going to take forever. And the big question is whether white really has that kind of time to fix their structure without Capablanca creating even more problems. Now, let's look at another example from Capablanca, and this time he's white with Frank Marshall playing black. On the board, we've got bishop to g4 pinning the knight, and once again, Capablanca has already castled. And what he plays here is rook to e1, a move that does two things at once. It centralizes the rook on an important file, and at the same time, it frees up the f1 square for the knight. The idea here is pretty clear. Bring the knight to e3, and from there, just kick the bishop away. Black goes h6, and Capablanca just sticks to his plan. Knight to f1, knight to h7, and finally, knight to e3, attacking the bishop. And this is where you really want to pay attention, because if they trade on f3, that's great for white. The queen recaptures and comes into the game, the knight picks up some nice squares without the bishop controlling them, and the queen gets really active. Overall, it's just a good position for white. But in the game, Marshall goes bishop to h5, and Capablanca answers with g4. Notice how this time there's no need to play h3 because the knight already backs up that pawn bush. So you break the pen like right away and start grabbing space on the king side. Black's plan was to go f5 and use the pen as the foundation of an attack. But in just 2 moves, Capablanca completely turns the tables. Now he's the one expanding on the king side, black is stuck defending the entire time, and the position starts getting, really uncomfortable for them, right? That knight on f5 just dominates the position and starts pressuring everything around it because it lands on key squares and basically seriously limits black's options. And if black decides to trade, once pawn takes, white opens up the g-file for the rook. So on top of the extra space, you also get a fully open file to attack on. Now take a calm look at this position and tell me, would you rather be black or white here? Well, I'm pretty sure it's white, even if you look at white's king and think it seems exposed since the g-pawn is gone. But here's the real question. How exactly is black ever getting to that king, So the main lesson from these 2 games is that a pin doesn't have to mean you're stuck playing passively. Capablanca shows that you can absolutely turn that early pressure into counterplay and full positional control, even with your king already castled. Capablanca didn't hesitate to go g4, g5 right in front of his own king. He proves that breaking your castled pawn structure is only fatal if your opponent actually has active pieces to punish it. And for beginners, the most valuable idea here is understanding that a king is only truly exposed if your opponent has the firepower to get to it. And knowing exactly how to create that counterattack and take over the board after the opening is what really separates beginners from advanced players. So if you never want to feel lost when you reach this stage of the game, go click the video that's on your screen right now, where I break down the 10 middle game rules that will completely transform the way you play. Click now, because if you stop here, you already know how this story ends. If you enjoyed and learned something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.